The Great Migration by Steve Ramirez is that book that will get you fired up and seriously contemplating what will happen next, because while reading it, you will be slapped with unexpected events. You can grab yourself a copy of this book at Online Book Club. Bookshelf Chronicles has a surprise for you though. Guess what? We have the author, Mr. Steve Ramirez, here for an interview. Let's get to meet him and discuss more about the book. Who is Steve Ramirez, and what inspired you to pursue a career in writing?
I'm 54 right now. When I was 49, Game of Thrones was on TV, and I was a big fan of it. And I spent my whole life, the last 20-something years in medical science. So I don't have any writing experience prior to writing this book. But I was, as I said, a big fan of Game of Thrones, and when it ended, I was very displeased with the ending. As a lot of people were, a lot of the fans of the show were. So I was storming around the house for like a week and complaining about it. My wife was like, why won't you let this go? Why is it such a big deal? And I said, well, I just don't understand why these shows can't be ended well. Like, this was like the fourth or fifth show we had watched, and the endings were always just disappointing to us. You know, there's all this suspense and everything, and then it just seems like they give up and just end it. And I said, is it really so hard to end a show well? And she was so tired of hearing me talk about it. She said, I don't know, why don't you go over to your computer and write a story and find out? And that was basically how I started writing. I said, I think I'm going to do that. And went over. After about a month, I said, I think I've got a story here. I think I've got to study some things. And so I spent the summer studying general relativity, some quantum mechanic theory, just stuff like that. All the things that you see in the Great Migration about halfway through, where the story really gets going and all of the mystery of what's going on is revealed to the reader. Those were all the things, the physical principles I wanted to have in place. That's what I was studying that summer. And then after that, it was just a matter of, and of course I did study a lot about diseases. Because I had a lot of resources, human resources available to me. I was very lucky because I work in in medical sales. I had access to people that could give me input on communicable disease. And I had a friend that was working on her PhD, and she had access to all this software. And so once I decided on which diseases I would, base the disease in the book on, we started running contagion models. I said, look, here's the city, here's the size. I need this to happen, this kind of an onset. This, I want this city within 10 minutes of the first case to be in total chaos. And so we would run these models through to see exactly how quickly it would have to hit the carrier or the host to then spread it to other people. And that was really fun. So everything you see in that book, we modeled through simulation software, because I was like, I want the entire city to be devastated within 20 minutes. And she was like, okay. And yeah, it was really fun. It was exciting. But that's how it was, just bit by bit, the story came together. And it was very important to me to, because science fiction, I think good science fiction, at least the science fiction I enjoy, it's always got a pretty good grasp of reality. And then it kind of builds on that. It doesn't get too ridiculous.
Why did you write the book, The Great Migration, and why do you think readers should check it out?
Well, as I said, I wrote it just because it was suggested to me by my wife. I think the fans of, because it is science fiction, but it reads a lot like fantasy. It's a low technology civilization. I think people that just kind of, as you said earlier, just kind of want to go into a story that whisks them away and is very fast-paced. At least I hope it reads as fast-paced. It's a broad-scale adventure story, at its core, and it's really for me, it's more of a survival story. I like the characters. I think the characters, at least what I tried to do was have their resume like in the book. Like there's nobody that just shows up and is very strong or very well trained with no reference to their life. Like Bologna, Luda, Lacey, Rael, they all survived that year in the valley. They know what hardship is. They know how to work together. Cordero is very big. He's got training. He went through SORN training. Dorinda has been trained her whole life as a part of her, education within the monarchy. So the people that I think shined when the climax hits, they're really people that are, it's known that they can survive this. And still, because I read a lot of survival books to prepare these characters, and especially in the Azanon chapters, when he's thinking about the lessons that Captain Riker had imparted upon the children in the royal family. That was all taken from a book called Deep Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez. It's a really good book on how to survive in a wilderness setting and really, adopt a survival mentality. So for me, a lot of that book really feels like a survival story to me, in a science fiction setting.
Okay. By the way, these parts of Azanon, when he was trying to escape with the little girl Kyra, were really, really well described. To me, the details were really on point, and the survival mode was 100% activated.
You had asked me what my favorite part of the book was when we were emailing each other.
Yeah.
And that is my favorite part. Those chapters with Azanon and Kyra, for two reasons. I like their dynamic because Azanon is highly intelligent, but he's old and he's not strong or fast, and he has very limited resources in himself to survive that situation. He's isolated, he's terrified, and that opening scene where he's hiding in that clothing store and he's too scared to even go lock the door, and he doesn't know how he's going to get out. And I looked at the first page of that chapter for about a week. I could not, I really thought I was stalled. I could not come up with a way to get him out of it. And so I started going through my notes, and I found a chapter where the principles that he remembers, Captain Riker in the classes teaching Lemuel how to survive, I said, maybe I've got to, he is the royal tutor. He would be present for those lessons. I just got to get him to remember. And that, once I established that, then the chapter came very quick, because I knew, I knew how to get Kyra to him, and the whole thing just built tension.
Yeah.
They only knew each other for an afternoon, but when they take off together, it feels like they're close, they're both committed to one another. And, kids are so resourceful naturally. They've got that, I think they can recognize danger in a situation like that. I think they're, nimble enough and they can hide. And that's exactly what Kyra was doing up to the point that she met Azanon. And then, he's such a good guy. It just felt very natural for them to, head out into that night, not knowing what was ahead of them, but they were together. I love that part. The end of that chapter, and I can't remember the name, but the end of the chapter where they've got themselves camouflaged and,
In the shadow.
That's my favorite. That is my favorite part of the book.
Who is your favorite character in the book?
It is such a tough question, Risper. For me, because in the first book, because you have to understand, I wrote the first chapter of that book literally 35 times. Because I didn't know who my protagonist was going to be. And there were all those characters in that group. And I would write it from each character's perspective. And it took me a long time to figure out that Bologna was going to be the protagonist. And I had this but her character arc spans 3 books. So her development in the first book is nowhere near complete. So to answer your question, in the first book, I think my favorite character, and Dorinda, the same thing. Dorinda has her character arc is long. It goes well into the 3rd book. So she's a very entertaining character. But I think knowing what the full story is, I think Cortez might be my favorite character in the first book. Because I don't know if it comes through, but he's a very reluctant monarch. It's a constitutional monarchy. For the people that haven't read the book, that he's been appointed to that position. His wife was actually the queen. He had just married into that. And then, when she died, he was stuck with all that responsibility. And so what I'm hoping comes through is that he sees himself as a temporary placeholder in the monarchy. He's really trying to get his kids up to speed so they can take over and assume their rightful position. But in spite of all that, when the stakes are clear to him about what's happening within the Crystal City, he doesn't hesitate to step up and start really organizing and trying to figure out what's going on, because early on in that story they find that hand, and it's not clear to the reader at the time, but the gravity of finding a sworn hand in the middle of the city and not knowing where it came from, that would be terrifying to anybody living in that city.
What is the inspiration behind the incredible world building in your book?
Well, I leaned very heavily on a book titled Guns, Germs, and Steel. And you got to understand, I used to just read nonfiction. I was always reading nonfiction to learn about the world. And when I became very interested about how the modern world came to be what it is, that book, Jared Diamond wrote it. And it really, more than any book I've ever read, really describes, because he's an anthropologist by training, it really just shows you how humanity spread across the globe, from Africa, where the opportunities were to domesticate plants and animals, where the opportunities were to create permanent civilizations, and the resulting technology that developed from those, the large cities, the mega cities that came to be. It did a great job of helping me understand how humanity works in terms of civilization. And so I used the principles in that book to kind of create that world, because it was very important. And when my book was Book of the Month with the online book club, I got a lot of reviews. I got like a lot, maybe over 100 reviews. And consistently people said the world seemed very real to me. And I have to think that's why, because after reading that book and a lot of other books, but that was the one that influenced the way I thought. I put the emphasis on agriculture, and there's a chapter in that book where it talks about what happened to that country when their agricultural supply chain was disrupted. It led to a lot of things. And when you look at conflict in the world, modern world and past, it almost always starts with a battle for resources. whether it's water or arable land, or if there's a drought that wipes crops out and people have to leave that area so they don't starve. I mean, that's generally the consistent theme. And so I wanted it to seem like that country understood them because of, there's a bard that is talking about the past and why they prioritize it, why they value their farmers and their agriculture and their water supplies so much. And that gives rise to a stable society. It's funny, I don't really remember where the crystal themes came from for the Crystal City, because I got asked that question the other day, and I know that I cannot remember where I came up with them. But I wanted to leave it until late in the book for it to really be revealed. It's that scene in the Crystal Cavern where Lute is looking around and he sees all the gemstone deposits, and he understands why the Crystal City is what it is, how they just adopted that as their culture. It's fun and it's evocative. And I knew that the Cabochon Festival was going to be the big climax, and I wanted it to have a personality going in.
Princess Dorinda is the most daring character in the book. What inspired her character?
I originally wrote her to be a villain, because I thought the book needed some colorful characters, somebody to kind of put the reader on edge. And then early on, my beta readers, they really liked her. They were like, no, we like this character. She's good. So I had to consider Dorinda as more of just a villain character, and really kind of consider what would make her act that way. And I liked Dorinda a lot. By the time you get to the third book in the series, she has really come around, and I had a lot of help. A friend of mine is a licensed clinical social worker, and when I talked about my idea for Dorinda, what her backstory was, I said, what would this look like in the real world? How do people like this behave? What is their self-awareness like? And he really straightened me out on what was realistic. He said, if somebody's struggling with suppressed memories, it's not like a movie where something jogs that memory and all of a sudden they have a very clear view of their past. He said it's almost impossible to drag these memories out of them when they've repressed them. So he gave me some really good insight on how to write her over 3 books. But in the first book, she's still very visceral with her emotions. She's very dependent on alcohol and drugs to kind of get through the day. And but at the same time, she's been very well educated. She's highly trained. She's in great physical shape because she has easy access to food and training equipment and trainers and all this other stuff. So when the climax of the book hits, Dorinda is very well prepared to survive, whereas Lena is not. And I really like the way those two came together, and their relationship develops really nicely over the course of the trilogy. But in that first book, I found them to be a very satisfying part of the story. It was because they were so antagonistic. Dorinda was so antagonistic to Lena in that first chapter that they showed up. There was a point in writing that book where I'm like, how am I going to reconcile these two characters and put them together for the climax? How could that possibly happen? But it all worked out.
If your book was adapted into a movie, which actors would you consider playing the roles of Princess Dorinda, Bellona, King Cortez, Azanon, and Sergeant Cordero?
That's a really good question. And the funny thing is, for most of the characters, I don't like Dorinda. It's Dorinda's physicality is based off my friend Angie from like 30 years ago. Like, and just physically, like Angie didn't act like Dorinda, but just physically, because Angie's got very thick hair and very, dark, long curls. So when you sent me, when we were emailing each other, I knew you would be asking this question. I kind of went online, and the closest person, and the funny thing is I'm so out of it, I don't even know. I think this person's famous enough to say their name and have people, but do you know who Ciara is? I think she's either a singer or an actor or both. Okay, so Ciara kind of looks like what I would picture Dorinda to look like. She's got that, I gotta be honest with you, Risper, I only saw one picture of her. I went, oh yeah, there we go. Like, that's what Dorinda looks like. But her hair was down, but it's like that, like it's clearly like curly, long, very thick hair, so that's, I think she could play Dorinda pretty well, and to be true to my mental picture of for Bologna, like I never really saw a consistent face in my mind. But the funny thing is, my wife and I were watching the Dune movie on HBO, and the movie Dune, and my wife was watching it, and she looked at me and she said, Zendaya could be Bologna. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, you're right. And from that point on, every time I sat down to write Bologna or I read her, I think of Zendaya. Because she really physically is just like what I imagined Bologna to look like. And for Cortez, once again, going back to the Dune movie, and I think it's because his character was the patriarch of a family, but Oscar Isaac, the father in Dune, he looks to me like Cortez. Because he's got dark hair. Cortez, of course, has that thick beard, but I had always envisioned Cortez as like a Middle Eastern, Mediterranean kind of presentation, thick dark hair, dark beard, kind of like olive skin, dark eyes. That's how I envisioned him. And Oscar Isaac, who plays the father, and he's a very famous actor. He's in a lot of stuff. I can't think now of all the movies he's been in, but he was the father that gets killed in Dune. He kind of like looks like Cortez to me. And then the funny thing is, Azanon, I had the clearest mental picture of all the characters. And it's because I envisioned, have you ever seen that movie? And it's an old movie. It's like from I think the 80s or the early 90s, called The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis. Well, at the very start of that movie, I think they're in Egypt, and there's an archaeologist, and he's this older guy. He looks Egyptian, but I looked it up for this interview, and the guy's name is John Bluthal, and I think he's British, so he doesn't even look like the character in the movie. But the character in that movie, he's plays in a scene with Luke Perry. He's what I imagined Azanon to look like. Just this older guy, very academic looking. Obviously the guy in that movie's a archaeologist, professor type. But that's who I imagined, like, somebody in their 60s, but really more of an academic type of person. And then Cordero, there's an older actor named Clancy Brown, and he played a role in The Shawshank Redemption. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. Yeah. He was this really mean prison guard, but he's this big guy, and that was the guy I envisioned for Cordero the entire time. Even though Cordero's not a mean guy, this Clancy Brown character, he was just a very physically imposing kind of guy. But in a more modern setting, do you know who Dave Bautista is? He plays Drax the Destroyer in the Marvel, like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Like he has the physicality, I think, to play Cordero. Funny, oddly enough, he's also in the Dune movie. He's a really bad guy. But yeah, obviously Cordero would require a big man to play him. That's kind of who he is. Just, that opening scene that he has, and he's self-aware enough to know the reason he's working the protest lines is because he's intimidated physically. And that's a deterrent to the riots that they had the season prior. But yeah, those are kind of the characters. It's always kind of tough, because I have all these characters in my head, and they're so real to me. I don't know any of the actors, but I mean, in a physical sense, I think Dave Bautista would be a good Cordero.
All right. Can you please tell us more about the other books you have written?
Right now, the only other two books I've written are the books 2 and 3 of the trilogy, the Soren Saga. So the second book is called In the Shadow, and the third book is called A Good Death. And that concludes the series, but right now I'm writing a prequel to the whole thing, because I had a lot of people, when I first launched The Great Migration, a lot of people said, you should write a book about that trip around the valley, because they reference it a lot. They're like, that would be really good. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, that is a good idea. So right now, that's what I'm writing. It's just the prequel to the trilogy. But for now, I've only written the 3 books. I intend to keep writing and keep building on this world. But that's my whole resume right now as far as writing goes.
Surprisingly, we have come to the end of this interview. Thank you, Mr. Ramirez, for doing this interview with me. It has been interesting and really fun.
Well, I enjoyed meeting you, Whisper, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you today.
It was lovely to meet you too, and it has been a fun experience. As for my viewers, thank you for watching my video. I remain your host, Whisper. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And hey, see you next time.